Good afternoon. The topic of my lecture today is Rise and Decline of Taisho Democracy. Before descending into authoritarianism of the World War II era, Japan experienced a groundswell of liberalism in the early 20th century. For its rough correspondence with the reign of Emperor Taisho, this flowering of liberalism is known as Taisho Democracy. The term Taisho Democracy refers to the flourishing of new ways of thinking, strengthening of social movements, and development of party politics in pre-war Japan. From 1924 to 1932, 7 successive cabinets were formed by political parties, laying the foundations for genuine party politics in the Diet. In this lecture, I will sketch the history of the party politics that evolved in Japan's interwar period. After Meiji Restoration, Japan embarked on the construction of a new set of political institutions befitting a modern nation-state, including its first constitution, that is the Constitution of the Empire of Japan, commonly known as Meiji Constitution, which was adopted in 1889, and a national legislature, which was called the Imperial Diet, established in 1890. And party politics emerged following the establishment of the Imperial Diet. As I discussed in my previous lecture, these developments were facilitated in great measure by the Jiyu Minken, or Freedom and Popular Rights movement. However, in the early years following the establishment of the Diet, the government continued to be dominated by Hanbats, the cliques of former samurais from the domains of Satsuma and Joshu, which played leading roles in the Meiji Restoration. Around the turn of the 20th century, Hanbat's dominance came under challenge from political parties, particularly Rikken Seiyukai, or Friends of Constitutional Governments, a party founded in 1900 by Ito Hirobumi, the main architect of the Meiji Constitution. 2 circumstances helped open a new era of party politics in the 20th century. First, aging made older leaders from the time of the Meiji Restoration pass the torch onto a new generation. Second, as a consequence of generational changes, the political order shifted from one strongly influenced by Genro, or senior statesmen from the Hanbats, to a more open system of governance. Ito Hirobumi's career itself is very suggestive of these changes. Ito was a low-ranking samurai from Joshu who played a role in the Meiji Restoration. When the cabinet system was adopted to replace Daijōkan, he became the first prime minister. He served as the prime minister 3 more times. In 1889, he became the first Genro. By all counts, he was part of the privileged Hanbats, Still, he created a political party. This hints at the growing importance of political parties in Japanese politics. In 1901, Ito resigned from his fourth premiership. As head of the Privy Council, he remained as the power behind the scenes, but he resigned from the office of Prime Minister. From 1901 to 1913, power alternated between the next generation leaders, Katsura Taro, a Joshu bureaucrat and former army general, and Saionji Gimmochi, a court noble who succeeded Ito Hirobumi as the head of Seiyukai, the majority party in the House of Representatives. This transitional stability did not last long. In 1912, which was the first year of Taisho Era, Japanese politics entered into turmoil. When Saionji refused to increase the army by 2 divisions, the army refused to name a minister, and his second cabinet fell. The first movement to protect the constitutional government erupted, calling for abolishment of Hanbat's government. Under the Meiji Constitution, the prime minister was nominally appointed by the emperor, but the actual selection was made through discussion among the Genro, the elderly statesmen. The new movement demanded the normal course of constitutional government, which meant a prime minister was to be chosen by the majority party in the House of Representatives, which was the lower chamber of the Diet. Social pressure reached a boil to a crisis level in 1913. It forced Katsura, who had just replaced Saionji and started his third term as a prime minister, to resign after no more than 62 days in office. His successor, Count Yamamoto Gonnohyoe, stepped down when a naval corruption scandal broke out in April 1914. The emperor requested the Marquess Okuma Shigenobu to form the cabinet, but the second Okuma cabinet faced criticisms for its adventurous foreign policy and its premature attempt to remove the Genro from the decision-making process. Finally, a vote-buying scandal in the Diet brought down the cabinet. When the army's Terauchi Masadake was appointed prime minister in the spirit of wartime national unity, it appeared as if the country had returned to the days before the first movement to protect the constitutional government. But as Terauchi's cabinet was denounced as non-constitutional, he set up the Advisory Council on Foreign Relations to shore up the government's political legitimacy. The council allowed party leaders to participate directly in foreign policy decision-making for the first time. Terauchi's government lasted until spiraling rice prices sparked the rice riots of 1918, which I discussed in my last lecture. Terauchi was replaced by Hara Takashi of Seiyukai, the country's first prime minister from the House of Representatives. Hara formed Japan's first full-fledged party cabinet, consisting mainly of elected legislators from the Prime Minister's party. Hara represented a new breed of politicians. He was a commoner. He built his career in bureaucracy. By the Taisho era, the political parties had changed somewhat in character. They were now led by new men who came from the bureaucracy, the business world, and journalism. Those fighters for freedom and popular rights during the Meiji era were by and large gone, except for a few old-time stalwarts. The political parties were more closely tied to the officialdom and the big business than ever before. The extent of the influence and involvement of big business in the political parties is indicated not only by the number of party members who came from the business field, but also, perhaps more importantly, by the amount of financial backing provided to the political parties. It was becoming increasingly expensive to run election campaigns, and much of the money went to purchasing votes. The total number of bribery cases increased steadily after the Russo-Japanese War. The ties between the Mitsui and the Jiyuto Seiyukai, as well as those between the Mitsubishi and the parties that stemmed from Gaishinto, were well known. Party leaders solicited donations not only from the jaibats, but also from wealthy individuals as well. Wealthy leaders were expected to contribute from their own funds. The ability to raise and dispense political funds to party members gave party leaders a great deal of power, which made party discipline much tighter than in the earlier years. Hara's control over the Seiyukai, for example, was based partly on his ability to raise political funds. As a result, graft and corruption were the unfortunate byproduct of the tremendous need for political funding. Hara took charge of the government in September 1918. His becoming the prime minister was owed to several things. His party, the Seiyukai, was the largest party in the Diet, although it did not have majority control. Hara had strengthened the Seiyukai's ties with the business world and the officialdom, and he was able to maintain relatively tight control over the party thanks to his ability to collect political funds. But above anything else, being a conservative, Hara was viewed as a safe choice by the leading general, Prince Yamagata Aritomo, who, as the president of the Privy Council, could virtually decide who would become the next prime minister. As you may recall, the Meiji Constitution of 1889 had no provision for party government. Cabinet existed in separation of the Diet. By this time, however, Yamagata had reconciled himself to a party government, and Yamagata saw in Hara as an essentially responsible conservative leader who would not rock the boat and was best suited to heal the wounds left behind by the rice riots. Hara's primary objective was the replacement of a Satsuma Joshu clique in the government with the Seiyukai. But in terms of policies, Hara proved very conservative and did not betray Yamagata's expectations. At the time, Japan faced several problems, external and internal. Externally, Japan's relations with China were becoming increasingly strained, and the Japanese troops were on expedition in Siberia. Internally, there were pressing economic, social, and political problems. Labor movement was growing stronger, and the demand for universal suffrage was gaining popular support. Hara was hardly the bold reformer that the times seemed to demand. His policies were based on the old idea of enriching and strengthening the nation. The four major goals proclaimed by him were educational reforms, expansion of the means of transportation and communication, fortification of national defense, and industrial growth. These were certainly not different from the aims set by the previous governments. As a result, Hara's government remained relatively unresponsive to the demands for reform that were being voiced by the awakening masses. It delayed the expansion of suffrages. It took repressive measures against labor movements, emphasizing cooperation between capital and labor. The Gensekai, on the other hand, as the party in opposition, became the exponent of reform. In spite of all the pressing problems, Hara managed to fend off his critics because he possessed a strong majority in the Diet. He appeared to be at the height of his political career when he was struck down by a young assassin in November 1921. In this way, he became the first, but not the last, of the incumbent prime ministers who were felled by fanatical assassins. In order to preserve a continuity of policy, in the Washington Naval Conference, to which Hara had just sent a delegation, the Genro Yamagata asked Takahashi Korekiyo, Hara's Minister of Finance, to head the government. Takahashi was not the adroit politician that Hara was, and in fact he had a rather little interest in party politics. Consequently, he was able to preserve neither cabinet nor party unity when rival factions in the Seiyukai began squabbling over cabinet posts, and he resigned after only 7 months in office. The party cabinets formed by Hara and his successor, Takahashi, were followed by a string of cabinets made up of or members of the House of the Peers. This was due to two things. First, there still existed some who considered the very idea of a popular rule to be a dangerous ideology. Second, Genro Sayonji Kimmochi, who succeeded Yamagata following the latter's death as private seal keeper, was reluctant to let Kato Takaaki, leader of Kenseikai, form a government. Saionji did not favor Kato's adventurous foreign policies when he had been the foreign minister in the previous government. In January 1924, Gyoura Keigo was appointed as prime minister and formed the third consecutive cabinet, dominated by the members of the House of Peers, the upper house of the Diet. This triggered the second movement to protect the constitutional government. The two political parties, Seiyukai and Genseikai, which had been left completely out of the government machinery, came to reconsider their policy of placing the rivalry between them ahead of a principle of a party government. So they made peace to each other. After Kenseikai won the most seats in the next general election, Kato Takeaki was named prime minister, leading a three-party coalition with the Seiyukai and Gakushin Gurab Reform Club. This time, even Saionji could not ignore the public clamor for party government. At the same time, Kato, on his part, also made efforts to reduce Saionji's reluctance. As I mentioned, at first Saionji had been distrustful of Kenseikai for its connection to the 21 demands made to China in 1915, which worsened relations with Britain and the United States as well as with China. Now, Kato described Japanese, British, and US battleships in the Pacific Ocean as symbols of civilization and peace in the region, and he also appointed Shidehara Kijuro, Japan's plenipotentiary at the Washington Naval Conference, as a foreign minister, ushering in a period of harmonious Shidehara diplomacy. Reassured by these actions, Saionji approved the transfer of power between political parties and generally took a hands-off approach to the politics of the time. Before the collapse of the coalition in August 1925, the Kato government passed an amendment eliminating tax payment requirements to extend suffrage to all males over 25 years of age, and reformed the House of Peers. With a broader base of citizen franchise, the House of Representatives naturally came to be viewed as taking political precedence over the unelected upper house. Constitutional politics fostered democratic politics, and by 1927, when the Rikken Minseito, or Constitutional Democratic Party, was formed as a successor to Kenseikai, a political system with two major parties, Minseito and Seiyukai, and popular elections based on universal male suffrage was in place. The era of party cabinets continued until 1932, the seventh year of the Showa era. Meanwhile, disarmament efforts continued, and though Britain and the United States failed to resolve their differences at the Geneva Naval Conference of 1927, a treaty to limit naval strength was successfully signed at the London Naval Conference of 1930. At the same time, the Kellogg-Briand Pact on the renunciation of war was concluded in 1928, and Japan ratified the pact despite some grumbling against the pact. Meanwhile, further reform of domestic politics was under consideration. Typically, power transfers took place when the majority party reached an impasse and ceded the power to the opposition, which then became the new majority party at the next election. But some argued for a more direct connection between elections and changes in government. There were also calls to give women the vote, at first in local elections and later in national elections. And with the introduction of universal male suffrage, the proletarian or socialist parties gained a voice in national politics from the 1928 election onward. However, under the heavy impact of the Great Depression that started in 1929, the tide began to turn away from democracy. As might be expected, the Depression worked serious hardships on the masses. Not only the workers and the farmers, but also the shopkeepers and the small and medium-sized businessmen. The only business that prospered at the time was the pawn shop. Unemployment rose considerably as many workers were released from their jobs because of the declining business. Many unemployed persons returned to the villages to share with their rural relatives what little work and food there was, which increased the pressure on the rural communities, which were already suffering from the Depression. The factory workers who did not lose their jobs had to accept reductions in pay. As might be expected, the number of labor disputes increased sharply. The salaried workers were also underpaid, and in some cases they were not paid at all. The social scene was characterized by a growing number of children begging in the streets, infanticide, suicides of the entire families, prostitution, and robberies. Despite these worsening conditions and the tremendous hardships, taxes in the rural areas remained high. Many independent farmers lost their lands and became tenant farmers because they were unable to pay their debts. The enormous pressures of poverty intensified, and many farm families were forced to sell their daughters to houses of prostitution in big cities. These were the circumstances that led morally indignant young men and army officers, many of whom came from the rural communities, to turn to right-wing extremism. They were convinced that politicians and the rich were wallowing in luxury, corruption, and decadence, while in the countryside their friends and relatives were starving to death. While the junior officers and soldiers repeatedly committed acts of insubordination, the high brass also moved away from the civilian control, virtually taking the military and foreign policies into their own hands. Anticipating an all-out war following the Army's provocation of the Manchurian incident in 1931, the Army and Navy resisted towing the line drawn by party politicians and strongly opposed the further development of party politics and pursuit of international disarmament. And they undertook an unabashed propaganda campaign aimed at turning the people against the party-led government. Amid the heightening discord between politicians and the military, Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi was assassinated in the May 15 incident of 1932, which was an attempted coup d'etat. Saionji set up a temporary cabinet of bureaucrats while calling for a future return to party politics. But with the February 26 incident of 1936, another unsuccessful but destabilizing coup attempt, all hope of a return to the normal course of constitutional government was lost completely. Having ended its post-World War I domestic movement toward democracy, it was only natural that Japan would go on to reject the international order of the time and move toward military expansion, eventually getting itself into a war against the Allied powers. If you are interested in Japan's degeneration into militarism, there are many good books available. One book I recommend is John Toland's Rising Sun. This is the end of my lecture today. My next lectures will take a look at the failure of modernization in China and Korea.